you guys, time once again for my Tomes of Terror. This is my little book review series that I've been doing for quite a while now. So, as my previously stated love of the novel's horror store and my best friend's exorcism will attest, not to mention also the amazing nonfiction book, which is completely stellar and is beautiful looking. I own a copy. It's called Paperbacks from Hell, and it's kind of about the horror paperback boom of the 1970s and 1980s. So all of that said, the author of all of these wonderful works of literature is Grady Hendrix. And Grady Hendrix has become, in the last year and a half, whenever I first started reading his stuff, easily one of my favorite horror writers working today. He really does seem to have hit this really kind of winning sweet spot in his stories, which kind of like it seems like he's found like the perfect balance between humor and heart and having like thought-provoking themes but not being like real heavy-handed with it, and all of that interspersed with this really brutal and very like squirm-inducing like violence and gore and stuff like that, and all works really well together. This formula, I mean, if you want to call it that, sounds a little dismissive, but I mean, it might not work for everybody, but I have to say that every single thing of his that I've read has just delighted the ever-loving shit out of me. And his 2020 novel, which is one we'll be discussing today, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, is no exception. Matter of fact, this might be his best book that I've read so far, but I'm not sure, because they're all like really good. Now, I may have mentioned once or twice, but I'm sure I've mentioned once or twice before on this series, among other places, that vampires aren't usually my go-to horror subgenre, not my favorite horror monster, any of that. I used to be really into them, like back in the 1980s when Anne Rice was a big thing, and I read all of those. After a while, though, the monster started to become a little like stale for me. So I still do love a lot of vampire media, especially like from the old days, but I very rarely seek it out on purpose. And in fact, you may remember, I've had an experience recently, specifically when I read Brandon Massey's novel Dark Corner, where I started to read the book not knowing that it was about vampires, and then being kind of like disappointed when I found out that it was actually like about vampires. And I'm not saying that that's not a great book, because it was. Like, I ended up really enjoying it, but I still like I went into it not knowing it was vampires, and then I was just kind of like, oh, it's vampires, you know what I mean? But then like I wanted to enjoy it anyway. But that said, Grady Hendrix's book tells you right in the title that there's going to be a vampire in it, so I wasn't like as blindsided. I knew what to expect going in, or so I thought. The description of this book, which is on Goodreads and Amazon and other places, gives it a sort of elevator pitch. It likens it to sort of like, this is like Dracula meets Steel Magnolias and or Fried Green Tomatoes. To an extent, that's accurate, but please be aware that if you kind of are expecting like some like really funny, cute, like light and fluffy tale about like this gaggle of charming, proper Southern belles kind of like slaying vampires without dislodging their church hats, like in between sips of sweet tea or whatever, you kind of are going to have another thing coming. The story starts out kind of like that, but it does get pretty gnarly as it goes on. And actually ends up tackling a lot of deeper issues than I was expecting. I guess I should have expected it, because I think I said maybe some of the same things about my best friend's exorcism. But yeah, this kind of goes into some stuff like, you know, rape, child sexual abuse, as well as a lot of like racism, sexism, classism, like going on in the American South in the late 1980s. I will note that there is kind of like a dry sense of humor that kind of permeates the whole book, but it does get into some really serious stuff, and it is like pretty gory and stuff like that. So if that's not really your thing, then, you know, you might be kind of like surprised. So the story begins in 1988 in an affluent suburb of Charleston, South Carolina. And it's largely told from the perspective of Patricia Campbell, and she's this housewife. Her husband, Carter, is a real successful psychiatrist. He works long hours and is rarely home, maybe because of work, maybe because of some other things. Never really stated explicitly. The pair have 2 children. They have a teenage daughter named Corey, and they have a son who I think is about 10 at the beginning of the story. His name's Carter Jr., but he's pretty much always referred to as Blue. Also living in the house is Carter's mother, Miss Mary, who's suffering from Alzheimer's. And I guess, like, the thing, when she came down with Alzheimer's and couldn't live on her own anymore, like, all of Carter's siblings were like, well, we can't take her, blah, blah, blah. So they ended up kind of stuck with her. And it's terrible to say, but, you know, she's kind of, like, losing it, so they have to, like, take care of her. She lives in, like, this garage room. Now, other than that, the Campbell family, as I said, they're very affluent. They have a seemingly idyllic life, but Patricia is bored. She kind of, like, wants more out of her existence, I guess. Now, she did once work as a nurse, and she seemed to find that very fulfilling. But when she got married, she gave up her job so that she could take care of the house and the family and all that kind of stuff. Now she's starting to feel like, after all this time, that maybe her contributions to the family aren't really all that valued or appreciated, and she kind of wants some excitement, you know, like, you know, she sees it as a very, like, safe, drab existence. I mean, it's just constant cooking and cleaning and child care and elderly care and, you know, managing the household and everybody's activities and all that kind of stuff. And she's kind of, like, sick of it because it's like every day is sort of like the same as every other. But because this is a very, very proper, very southern, very wealthy, very conservative suburb, there aren't really a lot of outlets for somebody who's kind of, like, looking to spice up her life in any type of way. So Patricia does pretty much, like, the only thing that maybe she could do in this situation. Her and a handful of her friends, who are named Grace, Kitty, Mary Ellen, and Slick, they put together a sort of, like, loose book club, or like a book club. It's not really a book club. They keep saying that. Now, at first, I think that Grace, she's a very type A, go-getter, no-nonsense kind of personality. Now, she was the one that kind of, like, started the book club, and, you know, the rest of them joined later on. Now, her whole thing was that she thought this should be, like, like an intellectual exercise of some type. So her idea was, well, we have to read, like, all of these, like, greats of Western literature, which I'm not shitting on that. That's probably, like, a noble goal. But the other ladies really aren't having it. It's like they get part of the way into Cry the Beloved Country, and it's just, like, boring them all to tears. So they're just kind of like, Jesus Christ, can we please read something else? So they opt instead to start reading some, like, really lurid, like, true crime, like, you know, Truman Capote, like, In Cold Blood, Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me, which is about Ted Bundy, if you haven't read it, stuff like that. So they start reading that. Grace is not super, super happy with this situation, but she kind of, like, eventually gives in when she sees that the book club meetings are now, like, really lively as they all get there and they're all discussing, like, the latest murder book that they're reading and what they would have done in that situation and all this other kind of stuff. So it's, like, you know, becoming, like, really fun. The funny thing, too, is that they also have to tell their husbands, I don't think they tell all the husbands, just some of the husbands that would disapprove, that this is actually a Bible study group, because some of the husbands would not approve of their womenfolk reading this trash, you know what I mean? So I thought that was kind of, like, funny, too. So the first, let's call it a ripple in the deluge of horror that is about to befall this community, is when Patricia is out in her side yard, like, getting the garbage cans, like, to put on the curb or whatever, and she gets attacked by this elderly neighbor of hers with the very apt name of Anne Savage. Now, Anne, who just lives a few houses down the street, she has dementia, but it kind of seems like something else might be going on. Either that or her dementia has gone, like, way the fuck over the top, because the woman basically, like, jumps on her, and she's like, it's pretty gross, like, this whole attack. And she ends up not only, like, scratching Patricia all up and everything like that, but like biting off her entire, like, earlobe and swallowing it. So there's that. So the old woman gets carted off, you know, obviously Patricia has to get stitches and stuff like that. The old woman gets carted off to the hospital and dies a couple of days later. Now, it turns out that shortly before this attack, Anne's nephew, a guy named James Harris, had come into town to stay in the house to care for her. After Anne dies, Patricia, being a very proper Southern woman, does the neighborly thing. This is what you do when a family member dies, is she takes, like, some food, or, like, a casserole or some cookies or some shit like that. So she goes over there to take James something to eat. Now, when she gets there, she finds him in a kind of, let's call it, like, a very bizarre state that she's not really sure what the deal is. I don't really want to spoil too much about it. Let's just say that they get off on the wrong foot, okay? It's just, like, kind of a really weird situation. So the following evening, James comes to her house and, profusely apologizes for this whole misunderstanding. And from there, it seems that a really nice friendship begins to blossom between Patricia and James. James seems like very interesting. He's a lovely person. He seems like a nice dude. Now, there are a couple of strange things about him. For example, the fact that he's like, oh, I lost my ID, which isn't that weird. But then he's like, well, can you help me get another one? Because she kind of knows everybody in town. Like I said, she knows like the guy at the bank and all this other kind of stuff. Also, he has like this dirty kind of like bag full of money, like $85,000. And he said, oh, I found this in my aunt's crawl space. This must be her life savings. She didn't trust banks, stuff like that, which he has kind of like a story for everything, right? But there are kind of like things that maybe would be red flags. But Patricia is just kind of like really nice and really helpful. So she's like, oh, of course, I'll help you get an ID and I'll help you open a bank account, like, and put some of the money in and things like that. And introduces him around to the neighbors. And she also like opens her home to him, like he comes over for dinner all the time because he's alone. And the rest of the family also find him a delight, especially the kids. And actually the kids like relate to him like better than they do their own mom and dad in a lot of ways. And her husband Carter brings him in on this real big like real estate development deal that all the men in the neighborhood are working on, and it promises to like make them a whole bunch of money. Now, and I know that James is a vampire, but obviously the characters in the novel wouldn't jump to that conclusion immediately, as you wouldn't in real life. Patricia really only begins to suspect that something is maybe not entirely kosher about their charming neighbor when she hears through their cleaning lady, Mrs. Green, that little kids and teenagers in the black part of town, which is called 6 Mile, have been disappearing, turning up dead, or sometimes committing suicide after some unexplained illness. And at each of these times, people in the community who are very distrustful of strangers because of this stuff that's been going on have seen a white van. Now, Mrs. Green actually wrote down a partial license plate for this white van when she saw it one time, and it so happens that this white van has the same partial license plate as James Harris's white van. So as the danger escalates, Patricia sees some very messed up stuff with her own eyes, which again, I don't want to spoil. But the tension in the book and a lot of the scares and terror in the book, it doesn't come from, it's not like suspense over trying to figure out who the vampire is or like or trying to identify him, because you know who the vampire is, like pretty much from the second you meet the guy. I mean, there's going to be a vampire and this is a stranger and all this weird shit starts happening. So obviously he's the vampire. But the suspense and the scary shit comes from the fact that Patricia, and even more so as it goes on, knows absolutely that James is a monster, but absolutely no one, except for Mrs. Green, believes her. Even when Patricia tries to do the smart thing, I mean, obviously she doesn't come right out and say, he's a vampire, because everybody would think it would be like some Fright Night situation. Everybody would just think you were a lunatic. But she tries to frame the whole situation as, oh, he's selling drugs to kids, or he's a pedophile, or something like that. But even then, like when she's not even bringing in the whole vampire angle or supernatural angle, she's basically perceived to be like losing her marbles. Her friends basically like largely turn their backs on her. Her husband, who's a psychiatrist, as I said, tries to put her on Prozac. He just absolutely will not listen to anything she has to say about James. He even goes behind her back and like sabotages her attempts to like report James to the police. Nobody wants to believe that this really charismatic, compassionate, helpful, and let's not forget wealthy dude is anything other than a totally stand-up guy. And added to that is the fact that nobody in this upscale neighborhood wants to rock the boat and upset their like complacent, comfortable lives just because a few kids in that part of town are dead. Like it seems like it's not going to affect them, right? So the first part of the story, as I mentioned, takes place in 1988. And then after one particular event, it jumps ahead 3 years. And I think it actually ends up jumping ahead another 3 years. So it's from between 1988 to 1996, something around there. We get inside Patricia's head a great deal. And so we kind of learn how guilty she feels about not being able to make anyone listen to her about the threat that James poses. And then there's also the question of her questioning herself. Maybe I am losing my mind. Maybe I didn't see what I thought I saw. You know what I mean? So she's always like second guessing herself, which, very, very, very common, but finally, like, as the story goes on, with the help of Mrs. Green and eventually, like, the rest of her book club, she decides she's gonna just go, like, damn the consequences and try to rid the neighborhood of this dude once and for all, because he's become very, very dangerous. So I have to say, this book was a blast. I loved it. It was fun, it was scary, it was, like, super entertaining, and this was one of those books, like, where when I finished it, I was, like, really sad because I wanted it to keep going. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, what happens then? What happens now? Like, what happens with these characters? I got, like, so into it that I was, like, really bummed out, like, when it ended, because I just wanted it to keep going on. I particularly loved the main character, Patricia. I want to note here, too, that this is one of the best examples, because I think I've talked before, I think when I was talking about Richard Lehman and stuff like that, how sometimes it's, like, really funny, like, how male characters, like, write female or male authors write female characters, and like how sometimes it's like really funny. It's like, oh my god, no woman would ever think that. But this is actually one of the best examples of like a male writer writing a female character that actually seemed like a realistic character that actually thought the things that that someone like me would think. You know what I mean? So, props there, gotta say. And one of the most terrifying things for me, I think, was just this feeling of frustration that she had because she's being like constantly gaslighted, like not only by her husband and by like the other men in the neighborhood, but also like her own female friends who just think she's like losing her mind, like she's lost her fragile hold on sanity. She actually thinks this guy is a predator, and they just absolutely will not believe it, and it's just gets so frustrating, like how like having to like be inside of her head, like as everybody around her just like turns against her kind of thing. It's just really heart-wrenching, especially because she's right, and that like some really bad shit's gonna, eventually, the shit's gonna come home to roost, and it's gonna come to like the rich neighborhood, and they're all gonna be like fucked. It almost seems like there's not much she can do about it because no one will listen to her. I have to say too that the character of Slick was also like a big highlight, and I say that because in maybe another book, I don't want to like say across the board, but her character is like a really, really hardcore, like evangelical Christian. She's one of those people is like, she believes Halloween is of the devil and there's Satanists hiding under every rock and stuff like that, which, I grew up in the South and around this era, and, the struggle was real. Some people did actually like feel like this, but I feel like in lesser hands, her character could easily have become like a caricature or been kind of like low-key, like they were making fun of her, like she became like a figure of derision or something like that in the story, but she absolutely isn't. Her character is very complex, she's very fleshed out, she ends up being very honorable, and in the end like quite heroic, and I thought that was kind of cool. All the characters are, but I liked her character like specifically. I think one of the best things about Hendrix's writing, or one of the things I like best about his writing, is that he seems to have genuine sympathy for all of his characters, no matter how flawed they may be. And as I alluded to earlier, the story also kind of touches on a lot of interesting themes without being real heavy-handed about it. Obviously you have a theme of like the sort of subtle and not so subtle racism operating in the American South in this time period. Like I said, just the whole thing between this particular neighborhood and that neighborhood, and like how they didn't really care about it until it started happening to them. There was that. Going along with that, the way the sort of affluent like viewed the lower classes in general, the way being wealthy and charming can kind of allow you to get away with pretty much anything, because everyone will just take you at face value. There's also sort of like it kind of tackles too the devaluing of the work that housewives do, like to keep their families and households functioning, how it's just not seen as important, and just kind of like the belittling of women's opinions and their interests in general by certain types of dudes. So you kind of get into that, but like I said, it's not really heavy-handed, and it's done with sort of like a dryly humorous kind of tone to it, so it's just really enjoyable and kind of like droll, you know what I mean? So I thought that was like really, really funny. Now keep in mind, if you are at all squeamish, please do not go into this thinking it's going to be some little fun, breezy. It is fun, but don't think it's going to be some little breezy romp or anything, because this thing gets pretty disgusting at times, especially if you weren't expecting it to go like that. If you have a phobia of rats or cockroaches in particular, you might want to stay far away from this because there was a couple scenes in this. I don't have a phobia about rats, but even so, there was a scene in here that I was kind of like, ew. And then there's a couple scenes in here with cockroaches, and I absolutely do have a phobia about cockroaches, and one of them I was just like crawling out of my skin. Oh, it was so nasty. But yeah, so actually there was 2 scenes like that did that because I do not like cockroaches at all. Yeah, so you might want to stay far away, or at least be, brace yourself for it. There's also, I'm gonna say, a pretty nasty rape scene, and kind of like a pretty graphic like description of the aftermath of it. There's some pretty fucked up shit happening to children and teenagers, and there is a very graphic dismemberment toward the end. I did see actually a few reviews on Goodreads from people who were kind of expecting this book to be this like cute, lighthearted little comedy story because of the title and the description, but then they were like shocked when the gross shit started happening. So if that's not your bag, then just be warned. There is some really, really nasty shit in this. It does have humor in it, but it is still a horror story with a capital H horror. So just know that going in, if you're squeamish, it does have some pretty disgusting shit in it. So I'm going to say, as I probably said on the other reviews that I've done of his books, I mean, Grady Hendrix, he's just, every single thing that I've read of his, I've adored. And I'm just like looking forward to reading the rest of his catalog. I mean, he's written like a few more novels. I think he wrote one called The Final Girl Support Group and one called They Sold Their Souls or something like that. And he's written a lot of nonfiction as well. I've like I said, I've read one of his nonfiction books, which is Paperbacks from Hell, which is stellar. I love it. But yeah, I'm definitely going to try to like read the dude's whole catalog because everything I've read of his is just delightful and amazing. And, so let me know if you've read any of his books. I know that they're quite popular in the horror community and people do have differing opinions on them. So let me know if you've read this or if it sounds good to you. Like, let me know in the comments and we'll have a discussion about it. And that will do it for this Tomes of Terror. I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.